Cool. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. Thanks, Jenny, for the invitation and the introduction itself. Whenever I give these kind of talks, I always think my mom must be proud. So we'll see what happens. At least what I was doing when I was 14, I get to still do when I'm past 14. All right, so this talk is about something that's related to Halloween. You know, we watch spooky things. We entertain ourselves with things that we would think are quite horrible. That if those monsters in these horror films were in fact real, they'd be quite frightening and disturbing, and we probably wouldn't want to engage them or interact with them in any way. Yet there's this entire industry and market that we all contribute to. And so I've been asking for a while, why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we entertain ourselves with things that we find to be quite awful and horrible? So first, what we should probably get clear on is what we actually mean by horror, what we think of in terms of the horror genre. And what I'll be exploring today is more so about what are the necessary conditions that need to be met in order to identify something as being horrific. So what I'll be looking at is a philosopher of horror. So there is in fact its own field, cottage industry on the philosophy of horror itself. There are academic journals focused on horror, such as Horror Studies. So this is an actual academic pursuit. Okay, it's not just purely fun and entertaining. It has those features, but it's also taken pretty seriously by academics at the same time. This figure here, Noel Carroll, who I'll be engaging with, teaches up at CUNY in New York, and he's developed an account of horror, or what he refers to as art horror. So this is a subfield of aesthetics. And what I'll be doing is posing a challenge to his account to then look at some of the implications, how maybe he gets some things right, but maybe not the complete story correct. And then I'll look at why we should maybe agree with him for understanding different genres, in particular film for today. I'm not talking about literature so much. To then develop a new account of the monstrous that takes some lessons from the Gothic. I'll look at some samples from the film In the Mouth of Madness as a case study, as an example of the kind of horror that I have in mind. To then develop an account of what I'll refer to as equivocal horror. Okay, so that's kind of the game plan. So we'll see how it works out. So this is Noel Carroll. He's produced this wonderful book on the philosophy of horror itself, or Paradoxes of the Heart. You have the nice Goya painting on the cover of Saturn there, engaged in a horrific activity. You then have Noel Carroll himself. I won't call him horrific, but nonetheless, he engages these materials very intensely set. And so I'm going to tell him why he's wrong. I wish that he could be here in the room at the moment because I'd love to hear his responses. But this is in fact a paper I'm working on as well, so hopefully I'll be able to hear his comments too. So his account looks at the way that emotions play in helping us identify something as being horrific. That typically when we're engaging some piece of horror film, that it evokes an emotional response of some kind. We might call this fright, or suspense, or anxiety. Oftentimes we think of these emotions as being unpleasant. So typically a good horror film is going to be some film that in fact generates those emotional responses. And this is something that Noel Carroll has clued in on, and looking at when watching horror, we should also keep in mind those emotions that come about. So in trying to give an account of horror itself, we have to recognize what's causing those emotional responses. Well, it's something that's external to you that's going to motivating you to run away. So think about how many horror films we've seen in which the protagonist is running away. And oftentimes as the audience, we may say, don't go upstairs. Don't close the door. Go the other way. Right? So there's some kind of motivation there. This external event drives someone to act in a particular way. And these events tend to be challenging, right? The power just decided to go out at that moment. Or the door was locked that never had a lock beforehand. Strange things have happened. So this influences your capacity to know what to do. That when we're in a frightful state ourselves, quite frequently we do the wrong thing. We see something similar happening in the protagonists of these horror films too. So there's something external to them that's motivating them to move in a particular direction, but because of the level of stress that they're experiencing, their competence has also gone down. In which case then they're probably not making the sort of decisions we would want them to make. As audience members, we typically tell them what they should be doing, but yet because they're in that state, they're not capable of making that decision for themselves. Furthermore, you then think from the first person perspective that what's external to you that's causing your fear is in fact causing you to be motivated as well too. So there's this agency that shows up. So then we can identify horror as being distinguished from other genres in its ability to cause an emotional state that is different in kind from the emotional states that other genres provide. So for Noel Carroll, he maintains that we could identify elements of the horror genre by looking at the particular emotions that are produced by those films that are not produced by other kinds of films. So that's an important distinction there. So he then has this account of art horror. So this is kind of philosophical fancy talk here. This is assuming that I, as audience member S, so label yourself as S as the subject, am in an analogous emotional state to that character we'll call C that is beset by some monster M. S is a currently then, so you as an agent are art horrified, having this experience by that particular monster, if and only if the agent is in some state of abnormal, physically felt agitation that so it allows for you as the audience member to realize that that monster somehow might be possible. This is why in a lot of films we see so much buildup of just normalcy that's showing, for instance, the film Rosemary's Baby. About 2/3 of it is just people doing their day-to-day activities. Why? Because the film is trying to show you that these are normal people, that what they're going through is similar to what you might be capable of going through, that the monster that they engage is in fact possible. Annoying neighbors, that's not too far of a stretch, I guess. But furthermore, that the monster is physically, morally, and socially threatening. So the idea here is that whatever's causing this agitation, it's possible, and furthermore, that it's a threat. Those are the two key components. Furthermore, that such thoughts are accompanied by your desire to avoid the contact of things like M. So in viewing the horror film, recognizing that thing as being some kind of monster that's causing this feeling of agitation, if you were to see similar things in your everyday interactions, you'd be inclined to avoid them. Think about how many people stopped going to the beach once Jaws came out. For myself, I was afraid to go into the bathtub. Any water association would trigger that fear as well. So this seems like a pretty plausible account. But my question for Carroll here is, must there be some object of fear external to the person experiencing the fear in order for you to have that emotional state arise? I agree with him that the emotions that are produced by horror films are in fact a good way to identify a piece of horror. I agree with him there. My question though is, must the cause of that feeling be something external to the individual? Must it be some kind of monster outside of you that if it were real, it would in fact be that kind of threat as a sort of threat it's imposing upon the protagonist in the film? And spoiler, my response is no, but we'll get to that point. So in some ways, what we can do is look at examples of horror. So up here in the background, I have Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street, the person who's haunting children's dreams and basically keeping them from wanting to ever go to sleep again. Imagine what effect that has on people and realizing that if you go to sleep, this thing's going to attack you. Imagine that anxiety, how uncomfortable that might make someone. That even sleep is no longer a way of escaping the horrors of the news, for example. Sleep is not safe. You have Dario Argento's Suspiria as well, monster there being a witch. It's part of his 3 Witches series as well. So that's a good example of supernatural horror. You have the classical Nosferatu. Think about the Dracula myth. And then you have The Exorcist, the possibility of possession, the fear that comes along with the realization of the possibility of demons taking over you. All of these evoke that feeling of discomfort, but all of them do some good job of showing you how those monsters, if they were possible, they would be threats to you. And the situations are real enough that it might actually happen. In the case of Freddy Krueger, we all go to sleep, hopefully, at least once a week. And when we go to sleep, there might be a threat. That should make you feel uncomfortable. With Suspiria, the protagonist is attending a dance school. There's actually just a remake of it that came out. I haven't seen it yet, though. But just going to to school, to going to the arts, to going to some institution, realizing that there might be some threat there. Nosferatu, just in the world. I mean, I don't think that many of us are going to go off to some awesome castle anytime soon. But if you were, there might be a threat. And then The Exorcist, just what happens with the horror of faith? Thinking about, if you account for a lot of the things that are evil in your faith system, that if you were to come in touch with that, that's frightening. And we try to engage in activities to prevent them from arising. So I agree with him in some ways, that we see examples of good horror films that generate that emotion that also includes something like a monster in the way that he describes. What I'm really curious about is that a necessary condition for a horror film? Do we require that monster? So let's look first at this issue of emotional agreement. So we can designate films on the basis of the emotions that they generate for us. So you have the film Airplane, makes you chuckle, makes you laugh, it should. If it doesn't, I don't know what's wrong with you, but that's not up for me, that's someone else's concerns. But yeah, so you have this feeling of laughter, funny, silliness, that allows for you to identify it as being a piece of comedy. Anyone not see Eternal Sunshine of Spotless Mind? Okay, good. So all of you know to not watch that movie right after a breakup. Okay. So this is, in many ways, a great romance film. Why? Because it evokes these feelings of longing for someone else, the memories that we develop with significant others. And so because the film generates those feelings, we can identify it as being a romance. Some people say it's a comedy as well. I don't know if I agree with that, in the same way that being a comedy as Airplane is a comedy, clearly. But we're not talking about comedy, we're talking about horror. So I'll not worry about that for the moment. And then we have Gattaca, which I think is a fabulous example of science fiction that has become real in a lot of ways now with contemporary developments in biology, specifically the usage of CRISPR-Cas9 for genetic modification. But also it's a drama, too. It draws out a story. There's a narrative. There's a main protagonist, a hero in some ways. There's a sacrifice involved. That if you look at the traditional views of myth and dramas, that seems to fit the mold pretty well. Why? Because it generates that emotional state, that inspiration, but being in touch with the dramas of life as presented through the film itself. So I agree with him in a lot of ways, that emotional agreements can help us identify genres of film or instances of those genres. And there are a lot of horror films that evoke this particular feeling that involve a monster. Okay? So I'm partly in agreement with him. But I want to return to this question of must there be, so must there, is it a necessary condition that there is some object of fear external to the person experiencing that fear for it to count as horror? So let's take a step back and think about, well, what do we actually mean by monster? So etymology helps here. Monster comes from the Old Latin word for warning, monere. Then you have monstrum, which means to portend or looking towards the future, potential threat. And then you also have the Old French of monstre. So it's shown up in our language for quite some time, but that doesn't really help us too much. Yeah, it's something that we want to warn ourselves about, something that's dealing with the future, potential threat. But more carefully, we see these divergent definitions of a monster. One being in line with our traditional views, it's an imaginary creature that is typically large, ugly, and frightening. Those are generally the aesthetic qualities to identify something as being a monster. We might think of it as just an individual person who happens to be inhumanely cruel or wicked. So perhaps a witch from Grimm's fairy tales. Those might be described as kinds of monsters. A person, typically a child, who is rude or badly behaved. This makes me think of the film Omen. Little Damien there. But also more of the comedy Problem Child as well. You have some child there who's behaving rudely. Incorrectly, you'd say, "Stop it, you little monster." Okay, I'm sure we've heard that either told to ourselves or heard others saying that to their own children. Possibly a thing or animal that is excessively or dauntingly large. So you see this in a lot of the earlier Japanese type horror films. Think about Godzilla, for example. Think about Attack of Giant Ants. The early 50s horror films were generally just some common animal, but just made really, really big. Okay, giant spider, giant ants, praying mantises. And now a lot of people are even more afraid of those things because they were presented with those objects in a different context. One that I find to be particularly interesting is the definition of monster from the medical community. In particular, this is a definition from the Victorian era of medicine in which a monster is a congenitally malformed or mutant animal or plant. So when talking about birth defects in early medical dictionaries, they'll actually say a monster with such and such feature. And then they'll have a drawing of it, of course. So we are concerned about monsters in every day, not just in a fantasy sense, but we evoke them quite frequently. So in this film here, In the Mouth of Madness, which I claim is certainly an example of the horror genre, it's not clear as to why it evokes this emotional state of art horror. In large parts because the source of art horror in The Mouth of Madness is not a monster as depicted in other films, thought to be part of the horror genre. So then the question that I would like to ask is, what is the source of art horror in The Mouth of Madness itself? How many of you have not seen this film, In the Mouth of Madness? Okay, it's the greatest horror film ever. Yeah, big claim, right? Yeah. So what is this film? Well, it came out in the 90s. It's part of John Carpenter's what's called the Apocalypse trilogy. The first one is The Thing. That's usually more well-known. People digging in Antarctica, said to be inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness itself. So people go digging into the ice, find something scary that should not have been awakened. It awakens. Things happen. Prince of Darkness is lesser known, but still more popular than In the Mouth of Madness in our culture. Again, about people trying to investigate things that they probably should not be investigating. When they investigate something, they find something, things happen. Okay. In The Mouth of Madness, though, it's not so clear. There's certainly this investigation that takes place, an inquiry into the unknown. And it uses a lot of Lovecraft-type motifs. H.P. Lovecraft was an author from Providence, Rhode Island, in the early 1900s, who basically developed his own mythology, his own pantheon of gods, and asked the question, what would happen if people came to realize that those gods are real? What would it be like to come into contact with this elder god from another dimension? Well, in most of the cases, if you've read any H.P. Lovecraft, people go insane or die. Usually doesn't end up well, though. And so we see a similar motif happening through each of these films. In fact, Lovecraft was a huge influence on Carpenter's own storytelling itself. So what I'd like to do is think about the movie In the Mouth of Madness for a moment. I'll just show some clips from it, so hopefully that'll work. I also have some good examples of what I'm talking about if you actually want to rent or purchase the movie itself. Those are the time lapses. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint later on. But the main protagonist is Sam Neill. And so he's pretty famous, right? Jurassic Park, I think he was in. And this is one of the shots from the movie. Well, it's interesting. He himself is watching a movie. So it's a little bit of foreshadowing there of how things go. He's decorated in some scrubs from being in a medical institution. That's been adorned with a series of crosses. In large part, the motivation was to try to persuade people that he was in fact insane, so that way they would not let him out of the sanitarium. So he actually wanted to stay in the sanitarium. Why? Because things had gotten really bad, because things happened. So what I'll do is I'll show just the preview to the film itself, and then a couple of sound bites, trying to get at the theme of what the movie is addressing with regards to our understanding of reality. So let me see if I can pull this up real quickly. Cool, so hopefully that's enticing. So what we see just in that preview, right, this common theme of investigating something. Well, guess what? They find something, right? And you can imagine what happens. You get some samplings of it, right? But it wasn't the traditional horror type preview in which there's something that's actually coming after you. It was a little bit different. There was just more focus on the environment, but more about the investigation. You're just seeing the protagonist trying to have an inquiry about who is this person, who's Sutter Kane, where has he gone, why did he leave, why is his publishing company trying to send him on this path to find this thing itself. But also you have this other phenomenon too about how the books are impacting their readers. Okay. I'm sure that if you were all here sitting in a library that we enjoy books to some degrees. Those of you who know me understand that I like books too. So what would happen then if you were to realize that your books turn out to be a threat to your sanity? Maybe they are. Yeah. So those are some of the questions that that the movie imposes upon us, and that should make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. Next, what I'll do is go ahead and show a clip where some of the main characters are talking about how sanity can easily be shifted in terms of agreement. So if you're a part of a community in which everyone just started to disagree about the same thing, reality in some ways would also begin to unravel. So the feeling of discomfort isn't coming from a monster itself. And does that make you uncomfortable, just thinking that what you're experiencing as reality may not be real? I do this to my philosophy students all the time, asking them questions of like, how do you know that what you're experiencing right now is real? How do you know that you're not, say, a brain in a vat being stimulated by some scientists to have this experience? You start entertaining these questions, it makes your understanding of your current situations a little bit uncomfortable. And that's something that they play on in this film here, is this idea of how do you know what's real? And when we start just poking a little, we come to realize we really don't know with a high degree of confidence that this is in fact real. We've all had dreams that are basically just as real as this current experience. Some of us, I'm not going to point fingers, but some of us here may have had hallucinatory experiences that seem just as real as what you're currently experiencing. So given those experiences, anecdotally, why not think that this too might possibly be either a hallucination or a dream? What reasons could you provide? In large part, what we see is you really can't. We have good habits that keep us alive, and through our habits that we come to think that this is real, and that's a good thing to do. I'm not telling you to stop doing that. But if actually pushed a little bit to ask, well, are you certain about it? How do you know it? What counts as your evidence? You'd seem that it unravels pretty quickly. And then that's something that this last clip emphasizes, is how easily reality could be manipulated. That pulled up the wrong link, so I'm just going to skip that. See, stoicism in action, right? It's out of my control. So the clip I was hoping to show is where he comes into contact with Sutter Kane. Sutter Kane is the author of these books. One of the books' names is In the Mouth of Madness. It's meta, right? You're watching a movie about a book titled this. Oh, and there's also a movie coming out within the movie called In the Mouth of Madness. It's weird. But when coming into contact with Sutter Kane, he's on a bus and they're having a conversation about, to what extent is Sutter Kane maybe God? Is it possible that given that Sutter Kane is this author, is creating these new realities, why not think that he too is God? And so what Sutter Kane does is a little test for Sam Neill's character, and it says, did I ever tell you that my favorite color is blue? And Sam Neill's character wakes up and everything is blue. Well, he starts freaking out. Everyone else on the bus starts freaking out. But then he wakes up. And so it's really confusing. When did he wake up? Did he have a dream in which he woke up to another dream and that was all of it? Or is that the means by which Sutter Kane was acting? So it should make us all very uncomfortable in asking ourselves, what's causing the fear? It doesn't seem to be a monster, though. It's more so about our understanding and seeing how easily swayed we can be from our understanding of reality that causes us to feel uncomfortable. So how should we think about this in terms of horror? Well, I thought, well, why not look to other genres? And so I thought, what's similar to horror? Well, Gothic has some similarities to horror. And so there's a genre called historical Gothic, in which you have some imagined past with supernatural elements there. And I don't think that's not really what's being captured here. You have natural Gothic, in which supernatural elements are explained away. So maybe you think that there's a monster in the corner, but then you turn on the light and just see that it was a chair. So there wasn't really anything there that was frightening you. You then have supernatural Gothic, in which the existence and cruel operation of unnatural forces are asserted graphically. So think about ghost movies, for example, that you actually see the ghosts acting. It's a supernatural element. But that's not what's happening here either. You then have another genre called equivocal Gothic, in which the supernatural origin of events, so things that are outside of our understanding of natural laws and physics, are ambiguously presented through perception of psychologically disturbed patients. So something dealing with mental illness is there. Sanity. And recognizing that our sanity is oftentimes disturbed, that then we can experience things that are quite frightening. And so that seems to be what's happening here in The Mouth of Madness. It's not something that's really supernatural, but more so has to deal with our understanding of what it means to be sane. And it's in recognizing that our sanity can be dwindled away quite easily that then these horrific events occur. So in asking, must there be some object of fear external to the person experiencing the fear, my answer is no. Why? Well, I think In the Mouth of Madness is certainly an example of the horror genre. It does everything that we would expect of a horror film. It evokes those feelings. But it illustrates how the object of fear does not necessarily need to be something external to ourselves. In fact, it illustrates how we can be both the fearing subject and object of our fear. Anyways, what we can do is start fearing our own sanity and the capacity for our sanity to be easily dwindled away. So what we see then, this is a shot from the movie here with Sam Neill's character sitting in a padded room decorated with crosses, being contacted by a social worker who's interviewing him to assess if he should remain there or not. And the social worker, in fact, says, you know, if they came in here and saw what you did to this room, they would certainly lock you up forever. And he essentially, his point is, that's what I'm trying to do. Get me away from the world, because bad things are happening. So we could think of how supernatural events, the unraveling of sanity, the coming of the elder gods, is presented through the perception of someone who is psychologically disturbed themselves. But the fun question in this film is he the one who's insane, or has everyone else gone insane? And he's just the only sane person left. What's the difference? So what I've done here then is motivate the case for a new account of horror, what I call situational account of horror. And so what I've done here is I've just crossed out Carol's elements to resolve on mine. So assuming that I, as audience member S, am in an analogous emotional state to the character, who for Carol's account is beset by a monster, I am deleting that part. I would just say that you are currently art horrified, full stop. Not necessarily by the monster, but you are in that emotional state of being horrified due to there being some abnormal physical agitation that's occurring that's caused by not the thought of a monster being possible, but the thought that someone's situation is possible, that the circumstances are possible, that somehow everyone else might go mad and you're the last sane person, that the person's situation is physically, morally, and socially threatening. That would be quite threatening if you were the last sane person. How would you communicate to others, right? How would you use language? How would you feel safe? Everyone would be a potential threat. So such thoughts are accompanied by the desire to avoid those circumstances. So in watching a film like In the Mouth of Madness, although you're not trying to avoid a monster, you still want to avoid those situations. So take care of your brains. So here's just the account without Noel Carroll's parts scratched out. So again, it's moving away from the thought of a monster being the thing that causes this emotional state. But instead, it's just the situation. The situation may include a monster, But what I'm claiming here is that it doesn't have to include a monster for it to still generate these feelings that would allow for us to count a piece of film as part of the horror genre itself. So, thank you. So I have about 20 minutes for Q&A discussion. I'd love to hear about your favorite horror films, what frightens you, and so on. Or you can just go and enjoy lunch.
What frightens me is not really any movies specifically, but like the idea of falling into the abyss, like the depth, the ocean, just sinking. Actually, I'm going to stop because it gets me into a panic attack.
Yeah. But films like, Jaws, I think do a really nice job of showing you that there is a threat in the ocean, and if you can't see everything that's around you while in the ocean, those threats may get you.
I don't think I've ever seen Jaws.
Check it out. Yeah, but I sympathize with that because actually the thing that frightens me most are actually black holes. Black holes absolutely terrify me. The Disney movie, Black Hole, if anyone saw that, terrifying. They had little animatronic robots in there that are freaking out because the ship's going towards a black hole. And just if you look at the physics of black holes, what they have the capacity to do, basically tear you apart, but your experience of it would be very, very slow. In fact, it would be forever. As soon as you get past that event horizon, the way that gravity works, the way it'd be pulling you apart, but how quickly you'd be moving, your experience of it would be forever. That sounds really horrific. Okay. And what's most troubling is that black holes actually exist. There's one at the middle of the Milky Way, and it's growing. All right, so that's kind of cool. Yeah.
It's coming for us.
Right?
Did you see Hereditary, the movie that came out, I think, last summer?
I didn't see that. I'm familiar with the story.
Spoiler alert.
Sure. Yes.
How many of you saw Hereditary? You did? I mean, I love the first half of it because it's going into what can happen from when a person is so completely overwhelmed with grief and horrible tragedy that this woman suffers, and her sanity starts to become questioned. But then the movie goes to that kind of external force that's behind it all. I don't want to spoil too much, so plug your ears, but there's like this cult of devil worshippers, and it's a legitimate supernatural force that's behind a lot of the bad stuff that's happening. But to a point, you think it might just be the woman, a character who's unhinged by grief, and I found that so much more compelling than some malevolent deity that's up to no good.
Yeah, so that has potentially both the supernatural elements, if it is in fact the deity that's causing the thing, but it's also possible too that just the devil worshippers have just read too much Lovecraft and got confused. And so then in which case that would be natural horror, but there's certainly that equivocal component to it, that the horror is really tied to the fact that her mental stability is starting to wane. Cool.
Yeah. You mentioned something about the different threat to physical threats,
Moral threat and social
moral
threat.
threat and social threat. What do you mean by a moral threat?
Yeah.
Threat to morals, or?
Yeah, it's morally threatening such that if anything were to be done to you, it'd be violating some kind of moral principle. So maybe you think that you have autonomy, right? That you have the right to make decisions that are consistent with your well-being. That's a general assumption that we have, but there might be some monster out there that is a threat to your autonomy. So think about like Saw, for example, in Jigsaw, that he's a moral threat in the sense that he's restricting people's autonomy and coercing them into making these decisions that they wouldn't otherwise make. Yeah. And we should all get together and just watch a bunch of horror films, and I'll just talk the whole time, say, see what's happening there. But that's also interesting too, of thinking about to what extent might a film like Saw be a horror film and not just, a thriller, a crime thriller in some sense. And really I think it's because of how you have a monster in the form of some actual person being monstrous, who's in fact that moral threat to individuals that would still allow for it to be part of the horror genre. It still falls in line with what's called torture porn now, because really what you're just watching is people being tortured, and that seems to be producing that enjoyment. We're a very strange species.
Are you watching Eli Roth's History of Horror?
No, sorry.
Really good.
Yeah, nice recommendation. Yeah. What's good about it?
They go over all the different genres of horror. It's like torture porn, so that's the one that was on this past Sunday.
So there's a different episode for each kind.
Yes, yeah.
Take notes, please.
Why do you think that the horror films of the 1940s and 50s are still relevant today?
Relevant in which sense?
Relevant as in they still get us.
Yes.
They still capture the audience. They still entice us. They still do all those things that even modern horror films do. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that a lot of it is due to what's generating that horror feeling to begin with. That oftentimes it's situational, but it's not really the thing itself. Also, being able to use camera tricks, makeup, puppetry, I think is more effective than using CGI, because I think that those things last a lot longer. We had just watched the film Bride of Chucky, which had come out in the 90s. But we were both Amy and I were commenting on the fact that it held up quite well. And we were asking, well, why is it holding up? Well, because they were using animatronics. Chucky wasn't CGI. There were only a couple of CGI scenes, like with the wine bottle smashing into the mirror ceiling at the honeymoon suite. That's, I think, really the only clear-cut case of CGI being used. But otherwise, it's just standard lighting and so on. So we don't really outgrow makeup, camera tricks, whereas we do outgrow CGI. So I think from a cinematography perspective, why those films stand up a little bit longer is because of just the techniques being used. But in terms of what the subject matter is too, I think it's very different. That oftentimes it's a social commentary. So I think about George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead. That's a social commentary in a lot of ways. Having Dawn of the Dead taking place in a mall and watching the zombies doing the exact same thing that they were doing while alive. Just going to store after store and just shopping around. That's a great commentary on consumer culture, that we've zombified ourselves. So I think in a lot of ways, the earlier films were trying to have a message. They were representational in a lot of ways. Whereas I think that a lot of the films now are more just about shock for the sake of shock. And I think that when you're shocked with something, that you can only be shocked so many times before you become, normalized to it. So that's just my thinking about that.
What do you, one more question.
Sure.
Do you consider any films where, that you consider to be great about never actually seeing the monster?
Yes, I think that in Asian horror films, the majority of the time you're not actually being presented with the monster itself. It's more about the circumstances where you're looking at people dealing with the possibility of a threat, but not necessarily being exposed to the threat itself. Or what is the monster is something pretty normal. So thinking about something like Ju-on, that you've got this small boy, as the ghost, and he's just staring. Like, come on, kid, stop. And he just opens his mouth and makes a weird sound. I'm not going to impersonate it right now because I can't. But it's nothing really out of the world. It's pretty normal, but it's really just about situation and context. Similarly with Ringu as well, thinking about having this young girl who had been killed, and you're experiencing a ghost in some sense, but the way that ghosts are being presented, in a lot of ways, they're just presenting us. And so I think that in Asian horror films, what they do such a nice job with is really just making the horror about who we are. And that's in large part with, especially in Japan, with recovering from World War II. So much of the horror was in recognition of, yeah, there was this horrible threat that wiped out a mass majority of people. And they're still suffering in response to that. So looking at how real the horrors can be. And so letting horror films in many ways help us get through the anxiety. So they're more cathartic, I'd say. So it's really more about us than about some monster. Cool. Well, thank you for your time and attention. Appreciate it.